Hello and welcome to the Path of Exile 3.22 Trial of the Ancestors meta report. This time we are focusing on solo, self-found, and hardcore, along with some of the unique metas produced by those restrictive gameplay modes. This time there's not going to be a community section or an economy section because I'm not very in tune with either one, to be honest with you, and I don't quite know where to start, especially when it comes to the economy stuff, since in solo self-found it's much more personal. That said, if you want to know how tattoos are affecting the more global economy of Path of Exile trade, stay tuned for week 3. Be sure to get subscribed so you won't miss it, as next week we're going over tattoos and how they've been affecting both builds and the economy. But with that said, for now, let's dive into solo self-found and hardcore in Trial of the Ancestors 3.22. So here we have the latest snapshot, aka week 2 on Trial of the Ancestors solo self-found. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the most popular builds and why. We've got Bone Chatter, Summon Raging Spirit, Righteous Fire, Explosive Arrow, and Lightning Arrow. So note, if we filter a little more towards success, i.e. people who have reached level 90 plus, obviously everyone has their own metric of success, especially in solo self-found, but I do think cutting it off at about level 90 is a good way to see who's established their character fully and who might be changing their build, re-rolled, all that kind of stuff. We've got Bone Chatter, Explosive Arrow, Righteous Fire, Summon Raging Spirit, Lightning Arrow. The builds did not change, the order did, and that's especially interesting, because in softcore trade, Explosive Arrow Elementalist is the most popular way to play the build. But in solo self-found, we're seeing a lot more champion players, which to me makes sense. Usually you fix an Elementalist's defenses with gear, but in solo self-found, you don't really have access to that gear. So champion makes sense, because all you need is a Dyadian Dawn, a relatively common drop, and a Quill Rain. Then you're good to go. We've also got some Perseverance enjoyers. This makes sense. It's a great way to get additional defenses and turn your defenses into damage if you are hit-based. This will not scale your Ignite. Alternatively, we've got Rain of Splinters. That adds a lot of clear speed and damage if you're barraging them. It's a little tricky to get. Some people have definitely got it. 7% of the population level 90 plus. A few people using Ventur's Gamble for more loot. And Skirmish is another common yet effective unique that gives you +1 to maximum totems. Let's quickly take a look at an example here. We've got a champion with 5.6k life, very good survivability, balanced armor and evasion. We are not using a Dyadian Dawn, making this a particularly good example, and it looks like someone got an Empower and is leveling it up. Congratulations, that's a fairly rare drop. You can see Awakened Burning damage, really strong gem, especially once it's leveled up. Awakened Elemental damage of attacks, the new Maven nodes making Awakened gems far more accessible than before. And you want something like a Thicket Bow with very high base attack speed. Now in softcore trade, flat damage rolls on your bow, or something else similar to that, always quite popular. In solo self-found, you don't get access to that nearly as easily, so you're looking at a bow that's all about the bow gems, socketed gems, fairly easy and deterministic to roll, especially on an item level 50 base, in combination with something like attack speed and minion attack speed to get just as many attacks per second as possible. Rain of Splinter, this is the corrupted only Crimson Jewel, a fairly lucky drop, and a standard setup of Ancestral Bond, Equi, and Elemental Overload. So Ancestral Bond is for +1 totem. Elemental Overload, because you're quite likely to have your totems crit, they are going to inflict bigger ignites, and Elemental Equilibrium to lower enemy resistances. This means that you need flat cold or lightning to attacks, such as on this quiver, but never fire to attacks, which is pretty easy to achieve. You just avoid it on your bow, quiver, amulet, and rings. Something else to note, you'll never see, or should never see, a pierce quiver, because if you pierce through an enemy with Explosive Arrow, the fuse is not embedded in them, it doesn't stack to 20, and it doesn't make the big booms. Now overall, I'd say this is a pretty tried and true setup. The only variance that I personally see quite frequently is Inspiration Support versus Life Tap. That kind of comes down to your gearing and personal preferences. If you can sustain your mana, Inspiration is absolutely more damage. If you can't sustain your mana, go with Life Tap as a pretty good stopgap. Just if you're doing it in hardcore, remember it does consume life. We've also got a Self-Attack Frenzy. You definitely want Frenzy for Frenzy charges. They increase your totem's damage. Culling Strike, because even though this can't do damage, it can hit enemies, therefore enabling Cull. And a good old Arcanist brand for Flame Surge, additional burning damage, and flammability. Then on auras, Grace and Determination for nice defenses, Defiance Banner to magnify those defenses, and Summon Skitterbots to chill enemies, nice defensive layer that's especially helpful in Trial of the Ancestors, or shock them for more damage. This is a nice, well-rounded build, and I can absolutely see why it's so popular. I think, in particular, Explosive Arrow Ignite should be doing really well in the leak mechanic, because enemies will waste time attacking your totems, and then you get to channel on theirs, and by that I mean your regular Ballista totems, not your Ancestor totems. You channel on their Ancestor totems, completing the mechanic more easily. It's also important to note that tattoos have had less of an impact on solo self-found, as opposed to softcore trade. That's probably why Bone Shatter is very popular. Righteous Fire, I mean, it's just a great, well-rounded build. Summon Raging Spirit excels in both Sanctum and the League mechanic, so I'm a little surprised it isn't even higher here. And Lightning Arrow is super popular because bows are very accessible. You get a lot of extra projectiles on the tree. We saw that in Crucible, and we're seeing it again. And most people playing bows are using the new returning projectile support. So not too many surprises overall. But let's go into a couple of specific examples of interesting builds and the way players have built things. Starting with number 1, a Stormburst Totem Hierophant. Because maybe you like the totem playstyle, but you're absolutely sick of playing Explosive Arrow over and over and over again. You don't want to play Toxic Rain. You want to go with a Spell Totem, but Ice Spear just doesn't appeal to you because it can be a little bit glass cannon-y and a little bit cheesy. Stormburst is a solid alternative. Now, one big advantage of Stormburst is it does a lot of damage and it hits a lot as you channel on an enemy. The big disadvantage is you have to channel, much like with the older Divine Ire totems, which is why you put it on a totem. But it means that cast speed is really important, so that's why we're seeing a Profane Wand. There aren't any mandatory uniques. However, I do very much like the inclusion of Doedre's Damning, so that you can apply an additional curse. That way you don't need the golden oils to come all the way over here and anoint Whispers of Doom. And especially if you're going crit and applying a mark, 3 curses would be nice, though crit isn't mandatory. So let's go over a couple of interesting choices that lead to learning moments. First up, you might notice that there is a Stormburst here and a Stormburst here. Why might someone have a self-cast Stormburst? It's specifically for infused channeling support. The infusion itself cannot be generated by totems, and infused channeling, therefore, is not a good support for the totems. But if you have the infusion buff on you, it grants 10% more damage of types matching the supported skill gems tags. Because Stormburst's tags are lightning and physical, you get 2 options there. And your totem is a lightning or physical skill, in this case Stormburst. Therefore, the infusion bonus that you get not only reduces the damage you take, which is a great extra defensive layer, but also applies to your totems, meaning that you have to channel just a little bit, but you don't have to worry about interrupting it too much. Also, this is a Mind Over Matter build, which greatly restricts the number of auras that you can use. This is why we see Vol Haste here. I would imagine only the Vol version of Haste is being run. I would not expect to see Haste reserving a ton of mana. And unfortunately, you can't see that from PoE Ninja, but what makes me think that's the case is Eternal Blessing support, because your non-blessing skills which reserve mana are disabled while you have an aura from the supported skill. So you activate Determination here, you can no longer activate regular Haste, you can only activate the Vol version because the Vol version has a soul cost and no reservation. This is one of those little tricks that you pick up where you can learn a little bit about a build even without knowing for sure. If you wanted to play something like this, cast speed is king. That's why we see a Lightning Golem. That's why we see a Profane Wand. And that also means that if you wanted a temporary support, something like faster casting would be surprisingly effective. We've also got Phase to Lightning, a good old conversion for extra damage. Stormburst itself creates a bunch of crackling balls of energy, spell totem support. You could probably use a Soul Mantle if you wanted, but Soul Mantle isn't the easiest thing to obtain anymore. And one very nice thing about Hierophant is it has the Arcane Surge bonus, which is of course cast speed, and because you want cast speed anyway, that is the perfect fit here. Furthermore, you also get access to things like Divine Guidance for 10% of damages taken from mana before life. Alternatively, I think you don't have to go the Mind Over Matter route. You don't have to go into Divine Guidance because you could alternatively go Conviction of Power. This would be more of a crit setup rather than an Elemental Overload setup like we see here. That means it's a little bit more gear reliant, but it gets over the fact that right now you're somewhat support limited on a non-crit setup. You get 4 power charges, that's really good crit scaling. You get 4 endurance charges, that's really good defenses. And you probably take the Ritual of Awakening totem nodes regardless. Regenerating mana feels great, especially if you're using it as a defense. Regenerating life feels great, and 5% more damage per summon totem means you want to stack as many totems as you can get, which is why we see Ancestral Bond. So again, this is an example of hitting and culling rather than dealing damage. I think this is a quite cool setup, and I don't know if he is still playing it, but I do know that Tatiantel, a Twitch streamer and content creator here on YouTube, did often talk about similar totem setups. So if you're looking for a guide or something like that, check him out. I believe his channel is Tatiantel2. The other setup I wanted to talk about is a way to take a build that I normally would not advise for SSF and port it into SSF with a very amusing character name. If you saw any of the ExileCon memes, it'll look a little familiar to you. So this is an Impending Doom Poison Pathfinder, abusing some very new and interesting mechanics to get base damage. Normally, a lot of your Impending Doom base damage comes from scaling the gem level. But in SSF, you're not exactly going to be getting a bunch of Dendrobates and double corrupting them to hit the perfect plus gems. And so this means your gem scaling is limited. That is where Spellblade support comes in, because Spellblade means you can use any decent Fizz or Chaos weapon. In this case, we are using a Breath of a Council to ultimately scale your poison damage. Because remember, poison is based off of the combined Fizz and Chaos damage hit. It doesn't actually matter. You don't need to convert. Fizz damage works just the same as poison. It's also got increased area of effect. That feels good. Increased skill effect duration, I believe, does not do anything too much, but it's still good. And increased chaos damage is definitely good. So overall, a really nice, well-rounded weapon, if you can obtain it. And for defenses, we've got Dawnbreaker. This is instead of something like a Lightning Coil or Cloak of Flame chest. That way you can use Dendrobate for extra damage. And of course, Vixen's Entrapment. This is a little harder to put together in solo self-found because you will need to find the Vixens. Though personally, I found several just throughout my farming and I haven't done that many maps. Admittedly, I'm in softcore trade. I'm not in solo self-found, but I do think that both Vixens and Dawnbreaker are perfectly reasonable. Dendrobate, super easy to find. It would be difficult to not find one in SSF. That makes Breath of a Council the only difficult drop, but again, it doesn't have to be a Breath of a Council. Realistically, any Fizz weapon or any Chaos weapon works pretty darn well, and you could always use it as a stopgap. Coming down to some of the overall setups, I expect that Enfeeble is pretty common here. Got Punishment, Despair, Temp Chains. Pretty standard auras, I would say. Withering Step, even though you are a Pathfinder and you get the on-hit effect, I do like adding Withering Step into the build for more effective burst damage on bosses, otherwise you have a noticeable ramp time. Of course, the Spell Cascade effect makes the Impending Doom build a thing. That may be going away in future leagues, so play it now. This is something that GGG had originally fixed in 3.22, completely breaking the build. They said, you know what, we're going to leave it for another league. Enjoy it while you can. I'm absolutely going to do so at some point later. Malevolence Aura for some additional damage, and Petrified Blood. This is a trick I see on Pathfinder a lot. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it because it's fairly high maintenance. But what you do is you take Master Surgeon, so your life effect queues. You have permanent life effect, or life flask effect. Your life flask is always refilling up your life, and that way you can effectively sit at 100% of max life with Petrified Blood. When you get knocked to 50%, it automatically kicks in. I just found that having to constantly hit my life flask is annoying. While it does work very well, I would rather just go with a Blood Notch combo. The downside, of course, being that in solo self-found, you're probably not going to find a Blood Notch and Immutable Force. So I completely understand why this is being done. It's just not the kind of thing that I prefer personally. Not only do you get movement speed, you get easy chaos res. Personally, I do not like the reused at end of this flask's effect, though. I much prefer use when full. The reason is, if for whatever reason you need a situation where you are not sustaining flask charges, maybe something drained a bunch of them, but you want to hit your flask manually to recover, reuse at end of effect will automatically drain your flask, assuming charges are available. Reuse when full means you have the option to do it manually. This is another thing that is largely personal preference, but I find having the option, if I, for whatever, mess up and stay next to something that eats all my flask charges, then getting back on track is a little bit easier if I can control it, because I know, all right, my chaos res won't be capped for a little bit, but I'm not in combat, I'm not fighting anything. I hit it at the start of the next pack, I get my flask charges off of that pack, and I fix the mistake, versus, well, my flask effect has already ended by the time I find the pack, and now I'm potentially in trouble. So overall, I think this is a cool build, and I really like using Spellblade support to overcome one of the weaknesses of playing something like Impending Tomb Pathfinder in solo self-found. Next up, let's take a trip over to Hardcore. And this time, I'm also going to be looking at level 90 plus characters. One thing that's very interesting and different about Trial of the Ancestors for Hardcore specifically is all Hardcore characters have a way to level up risk-free. You can go into the Trial of the Ancestors and compete in the tournament. If you win a round, you will gain EXP. If you die, you shouldn't lose your character unless there's a bug, and you will not lose any EXP if you fail a round. Therefore, the safest way to level to 100 is actually within Trial of the Ancestor. And as a result, I would expect that most of the level 90 plus characters are builds that tend to do well in Trial of the Ancestors, if not builds that are exceptional for it. And that's kind of what we see here, with Summon Raging Spirit and Explosive Arrow being absolutely massively popular, which is exactly what I would expect, because both of those builds do excel in Trial of the Ancestors. So let's take a look at a couple of specifics. First up, if you looked at softcore trade, you would see that there are a lot of Righteous Fire Inquisitors this time. We're seeing more Juggernauts in hardcore, which makes perfect sense. Jug has easy to scale defenses and you have to worry about damage. Inquisitor has easy to scale damage and you need to worry about defenses. Now in hardcore, you don't want to die, so you need your defenses to be as easy to scale as possible, thus Jug's popularity. Something else interesting is the number of Bone Shatter builds is a little bit lower. This used to be the most popular build, and it's been dethroned. We've got Explosive Arrow Champion. Now, if you want to know how this is built, I already talked about that in the solo self-found section. And there really aren't that many differences between solo self-found and hardcore when it comes to EA Champion. But the most interesting thing to me is Summon Raging Spirit, because in the past, this would have all been Necromancer. And yet, now we have Guardians. That's right, Guardian is incredibly popular due to its innate defenses. And boy, have we got some build diversity here. 68% Guardian, 19% Necro, 10% Champion. Yep, people are leveraging Champion's excellent defenses and the fact that Summon Raging Spirit does insane damage, even if you're not a poison version, to make a wide variety of hardcore minion builds. Let's take a look at one of the Guardians quickly though. This is everything you would expect from a Guardian minion build, stacking as many Abyss Jewels as possible, using something like a Darkness Enthroned, and going for the support minions so that you get the high level auras without having to run them yourself. In hardcore especially, this is super important because you want to run all of the nice defensive auras. You don't want to have to worry about, say, dying to ailments, so you run Purity of Elements. You don't want to have to worry about being squishy, so you run Determination. And this way you get all of the offensive benefit of having an Aurabot stand next to you, except in this case, you are the Aurabot for all of your skulls, and then they go blast the enemies. As a note, I highly doubt this is Eternal Youth. I would expect that it's converted over by Brutal Restraint. This is because that gives the Traitor, which refills your flasks. So this is a Guardian who's role-playing as a Pathfinder. Really cool tech, something that I absolutely like, and I think is actually undervalued in softcore. Now in softcore, I would honestly, at that point, drop the Life Flask. That's the sacrifice I'd make to have permanent uptime on all the others. But it's really cool to see this tech getting used more, and I like this Guardian setup. It's not as much damage as a Necromancer. However, it is far tankier, and you can integrate things like spell suppression just as easily, since you get to path through the middle and pick up Magebane. Also, there's a lot of dex nodes here. I would expect some of these are tattooed over to spell suppression, which is a really cool thing that has only been available for this league. So if you're looking for something to play that feels a little bit different, hit-based SOS Guardian should feel incredible while leveling. I've watched a couple people level a Guardian, and the Summon Sentinel of Radiance pretty much solos everything in the game up until like level 70. You just walk through and watch it kill everything. It has a pseudo RF effect, it taunts stuff on hit. I wouldn't be surprised if it gets nerfed, but if you're the sort of player who does not enjoy leveling, go Guardian when leveling. Respec later, you'll have the easiest time ever. And this is coming from someone who is very bad at leveling. But now let's take a little bit of time and dive into a couple of other builds that I wanted to call out because they are notably and mechanically interesting. First up, Garatha's build. I always find a lot of Garatha's builds really cool. And this one is no exception. Before the league started, he was talking about Frost Breath, where attacks with this weapon deal double damage to chilled enemies. Assuming you're able to do cold damage, you should hit hard enough that everything is going to be chilled, if not frozen. You get to use Heat Shiver for Trinity, a tech that makes this build do about double the damage that it displays here, and even this isn't fully accurate. So 14 mil DPS with 124,000 armor on a Juggernaut. Regular Bone Shatter's looking maybe a little jealous because regular Bone Shatter has to stun stuff, and this can instead freeze stuff. Now, as a couple of other interesting bits of tech, we've got the Frost Breath and Heat Shiver. This makes sense. I would expect to see a lot of builds using this combo, and Heat Shiver in general, if you can do cold damage, doubles your DPS plus enables Trinity, which is really, really cool. You just have to hit hard enough to freeze. This absolutely hits hard enough to freeze. Now, I remember a time where this amount of life would never be seen in hardcore. People had 7,000, 8,000 life. 6,000 was, oh god, that's squishy. And this really shows the level to which modern defenses scale, because you can get things like spell suppression. You can also get things like Tanuahi. Tanuahi gives you adrenaline, which is both a damage and speed layer, but it's also a defensive layer. And we saw the return of Eternal Damnation, one of my favorite amulets, because if you stack a bunch of chaos resistance, or resistance in general, you gain additional elemental damage reduction. The only downside is it's minus 5% to all maximum. So instead of being at 75% and taking 25% of normal damage, it is at 70% and you take 30% of normal damage, which means you take a lot more damage, except we're Juggernaut. We not only have access to max res to pump that back up, we also have access to applying our armor to the damage we take. And in theory, this could go even farther by applying, say, a fourth vow to the build, though you'd have to rework all the spell suppression and that sort of thing, get more damage shifting elsewhere, possibly through a Watcher's Eye. And that's another really cool way to scale your defenses. By applying armor to extra things, the loss of a max res counteracts the downside of Eternal Damnation. And this means you gain a significant buffer against elemental damage, because it's rolled against your resistances. That reduces it. It's rolled against your damage reduction, that reduces it, and it's applied to your armor, which is highly effective against the greatly reduced magnitude of the hit, since you have so many other defensive layers filtering it. So I think this is a really cool defensive setup. It's very powerful, and it takes advantage of tattoos. I would also expect that precise technique is in fact the best way to go. You want to hit faster and faster and faster. You want to stack attack speed. Ideally, you'd probably want to get a Flesh and Flame from Berserker, get even more attack speed there. I would not go with Aspect of Carnage. We're using Berserk because we can generate some rage. We're using Ancestral Cry to strike nearby targets. Everything you'd expect from a Bone Shatter build, but cold, which means you can freeze enemies, and frozen enemies don't get to move or attack, just like stunned enemies. This is probably hitting hard enough to both stun and freeze. Overall, really cool build. I bet it does super well in the League mechanic because it just freeze locks stuff. You get to use Taste of Hate. There's a lot of neat tech here. And again, if you wanted to adapt it, there's plenty of options there. I would expect there's a good number of people who copied this over to softcore and went for more damage and less defenses. Now, I also wanted to talk about the revival of a popular old build. If you played a few leagues ago and you played minions, you'd probably know about Dead Reckoning. And skeleton mages are essentially elemental projectile gun totems, where they fire a ton of elemental projectiles, you can't see your screen at all, and they do a lot of damage. They've seen a revival now. I think the main reason they fell out of the meta is they got a slight nerf. Skeleton mages were always still viable, but when things get a slight nerf in Path of Exile, usually the popularity greatly drops. Now with the Guardian, though, you get Unwavering Crusade, and the support auras from this are especially effective for builds that deal tri-elemental damage, like the Skeleton Mages. So we've seen a bit of a revival on the Guardian. Fleshcrafter is still quite popular. What Fleshcrafter does is it allows enemies to ignore monster resistances, which is very good if you're dealing multi-elemental damage, especially if you are doing all three elements, as you will be with something like Unwavering Crusade, because you have, the Anger adding flat fire to all of your spells. You have the Hatred, which if you're doing cold, you'll do more. You have the Wrath, which if you're doing lightning, you'll do more. So as the Skeleton Mages rotate through your projectiles, they're always at least doing fire and something else. Unfortunately, you cannot put Trinity support on minions. Otherwise, that would be absolutely perfect. But fresh meat support gets around one of the big problems of skeleton mages, which is they were kind of just stationary totems. So minions created get Wakened Fury. This makes them far better at critting and also gives them adrenaline. Because skeleton mages have a relatively long duration, it's a base duration of 20 seconds and can be scaled further on the Vol version. I believe the regular version of a gem is also quite similar. I don't think PoE Ninja displays that tooltip, but it's about 20 seconds, so you're getting a good amount of time out of them. And you get the Wakened Fury for 10%, so that's a couple seconds, which means you get a lot of value from fresh meat. This allows you to play crit skeleton mages without the ridiculous multi-cluster level of investment which you were tied to in the past. Furthermore, the reason I think this is especially popular on hardcore, Guardian has really easy to scale defenses. You pretty much get block for free from Bastion of Hope, and with Glancing Blows, that caps you. Let's see. But you don't need it. If you invest into block yourself, like with Tempest Shield, a pretty good shield, some recovery on block, recovering ES, recovering life. This is an insanely good shield, by the way. Then you get to be super. And for even more defenses, you get free armor and energy shield by reserving your mana. Now, without scaling a ton of mana, this isn't going to be super impactful, but it definitely helps. And overall leads to a build that feels very good. The, I guess, relatively speaking, more budget version of this would be an Aegis Aurora. That also gives you some max res, but this is an insane shield because it gives plus minion gems, life, and energy shield on block. Minion gem levels is the one weakness of a Guardian in comparison to a Necromancer. However, you are more able to make that up on gear, especially with tattoos, than ever before. If you have a plus int gem tattoo, for example, that's one level made up. You get one on your shield, you get two here, you maybe get one on your amulet, and then, while not necessarily quite as high damage as a Necromancer, you have similar levels of defense, and with the high level auras, you can be personally a lot tankier, letting you shift damage elsewhere. Overall, this is a really cool build. And so those are my thoughts on the solo self-found and hardcore metas for Path of Exile 3.22 Trial of the Ancestors. Next week, I'm going to be talking about skill tattoos. I believe skill tattoos have had a great impact on the softcore trade meta and a lesser impact on the solo self-found or hardcore meta just because of the lower availability. I've farmed almost a full stash tab of tattoos, but rarely have they matched up to the point where I could use 5 or 6 at a time. To do that, I had to buy them. In hardcore, the market's going to be smaller, so you'll see people with certain powerful effects, but less of tattooing your entire tree, and yes, there is a cool way to do that. So again, if that interests you, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the upload next week. And with that, I'm curious, do you play solo self-found or hardcore? And if so, what's some cool tech that you think's specific to this league that you found? Or did you end up playing an interesting build that you think's really strong? Be sure to share some of those experiences down in the comments below. And if you want more content, maybe check out my thoughts on the newly added skill tattoos, or read all about this meta report over at MaxwellGG. Links to both of those will be down in the description, and I'll have a video up in the card. If you want to help make more videos like this possible, maybe see your name featured in the credits, do check the link down below. And so with that, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something about either solo self-found hardcore or just some interesting build mechanics and interactions. If you did, leave a like on the video, and with that, I hope to see you again sometime soon.